You do not need to worry. You, the audience, will not be part of that recording. All you need to do to stay out of it is to stay muted. Only those of us talking unmuted with the little yellow box around us will show up in the recording. So don't be alarmed about that. However, if you have a question for our authors, you should please feel free to use the chat function to type the question in at any point throughout the event. And then when we get to audience questions later on in the evening, Davith and I will read those out for you. So please feel free to use the chat to share questions at any point, and we will get to them at the end. And then one very quick note, as I think everyone here knows, these are not easy times for independent book businesses and independent bookstores. One thing that you can really do to help, not just us, but any independent business that you love, is to shop early this year for the holiday season and shop local. So those businesses that you love, support them now and get your shopping done early, well, to help us deal with really supply chain issues, crowding issues, and make life a lot easier. So please, November is the new December, and thank you so much for that support. And without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Davith for our introductions of our guest authors.
Well, thanks so much, Rachel. It is my real privilege to introduce the strange and beautiful writer, Bobbie Ann Mason. Her groundbreaking first book of fiction, Shiloh and Other Stories, won the PEN Hemingway Award and was shortlisted for the National Book Critics Circle Award, the American Book Award, and the PEN Faulkner Award. Her memoir, Clear Springs, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. She's won 2 Southern Book Awards, the O. Henry, the Pushcart, an Arts and Letters Award for Literature for the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and numerous other prizes and awards. She's here for her new book, Dear Anne, her first novel in almost 10 years. And we're lucky to be joined by Steve Yarbrough, a longtime friend of Northshire and the author of 11 books, most recently the 2019 Massachusetts Book Award-winning novel, The Unmade World. He's the recipient of numerous awards as well, including both the Richard Wright and Robert Penn Warren Awards, and he has been the finalist for the PEN Faulkner Awards and is a member of the Fellowship of Southern Writers. Please welcome to Northshire Live, Bobbie Ann Mason and Steve Yarbrough.
It's a great pleasure to do anything through Northshire Books. It's a great store, the one that I've been to and in Manchester Center, and I hear great things about the other one as well. So thank you for having us here. I'd just like to say a couple of words about my love of Bobbie Ann Mason's work, and then we'll talk to her. When I was a young writer trying to find his way, there weren't that many young writers writing from the South where I was from. And then suddenly one day I read a story called Shiloh by a writer I'd never heard of named Bobbie Ann Mason, and it really changed my life. I've been a fan of hers for many, many years, but I have only been a friend for the last 4 or 5 years, and that's been a great honor. So Bobbie, if you and I were sitting together and I hadn't seen you for a while and hadn't been keeping track of what you were doing, and I asked you, what's this new book of yours? What would you tell me?
Oh boy, thank you, Steve. And I'm pleased to be here at this wonderful bookstore. What about this new novel, Dear Anne? It's a long story set in wartime, the Vietnam War, in the summer of 1967 and a few other years. Anne is looking back on her life from 50 years later, and she's on a cruise ship thinking back, and she's thinking if she had gone to California instead of going to New York after college, what would her life have been like? If she'd gone to California, she wouldn't ever have met Jimmy. She could hardly bear to think about him, but she felt a whir of excitement and unexpected pleasure in imagining her youth following an alternate path. People always said, "Oh, to be young again, knowing what I know now." Being young again in the 60s, what a blast it would be to start over in California. Wasn't California something of a dream by definition? She could reimagine her life, and Jimmy wouldn't be in it. Or it could have turned out differently with Jimmy. She wouldn't be in this nightmarish mirage on an alien sea. So in 1967, on a cruise ship, she's thinking back to her life in the 60s. And if she had gone to California, she would have driven cross country alone. So the novel starts with this notion that she's imagining herself in California, going to Stanford University of all places, which is totally intimidating to her. And she doesn't hit it off with many people. And she's intimidated by her classmates who are all males. And she keeps, she'd never had a boyfriend, and she really doesn't know how to finesse that art. And so she goes along trying not to think about Jimmy. And then Jimmy appeared. He wasn't supposed to be there. She's been trying to imagine a life without him, but here he is. Jimmy sat across from Anne in the Kelly and Sheets class. That's what he called the seminar on the poetry of Keats and Shelley. That was probably an old joke, she thought later. Whenever she glanced up from her notebook, he was gazing across the oval table at her, but he lowered his eyes when she noticed him. Her heart did a butterfly caffeine flutter. He had long, shaggy hair like a poodle dog. Random ringlets framed his face. At the end of the class, he shoved his books into a green canvas bag and slung it over his shoulder before he moved in her direction. Which is your favorite, Kelly or Sheets? He asked. Keats, of course, she said. How can that be a question? She was trembling. Touché, he grinned. He had nice, even teeth. He was smoking a cigarette. They headed down the stairs. Where do you come from? He asked. I like your accent. Kentucky. Can you hear my accent? Yeah, can you hear mine? A little northern. Detroit? Chicago. He sucked in a cigarette and then blew little contrails out his nostrils. Tell me everything about yourself, he said. Everything? Sure. What was your first word? First tooth? Stuff from your baby book. The sunlight on the main quad was blazing. As if they had a destination, they headed toward Hoover Tower. She was glad it was her heretofore embarrassing accent he had mentioned instead of the fatuous remarks she had made in class about Shelley's wind poems. Sitting on the steps of Hoover Tower, she told Jimmy things about her childhood she wouldn't have expected to tell, about milking cows and cleaning manure from the barn. His childhood was Boy Scouts and Cubs games in suburban Dullesville, Illinois. He apologized for his humdrum history. Let's walk, he said after a while. He stuffed her Keats and Shelley paperbacks and her notebook into his bag. Where are we going? She asked. Nowhere, just walking around. They meandered around the library and back to the quad. He zigzagged in out of the archways. She was wearing the wrong shoes. She asked him if he had been at any of the protests. No, but there's going to be a big one in the city in a couple of weeks, he said. Are you going? She asked. Yeah, I hate this goddamn war. He pointed to a bird high in a palm tree. Hark! Keats's Nightingale. Come on, Florence Nightingale, take my arm. He was tall, but not towering. She liked touching him. He wore a nondescript brown duffel coat, a blue Oxford shirt, and twill khakis with an ink stain on one knee. His clothes seemed to be an undergraduate wardrobe he hadn't worn out yet. She liked his long, messy hair and the unself-conscious way he walked, a walk that meant confidence. And he wasn't top lofty like so many Stanford boys. Well, that's Anne and Jimmy.
Oh, wow. Thank you. Well, I've got a lot of questions to ask you about the book, which, you know, I haven't finished reading that long ago, so it's still pretty fresh in my mind. I don't want to give anything away, so let's be very careful to make sure that everybody who gets to read this book has the full pleasure of discovering things as I did. But the structure of this novel is fairly intricate.
Yes.
And I'm wondering how easily that came to you. Was this something that you struggled with? Did you know how you were going to write it at the beginning, or what was the process?
Well, much less deliberate than you might think. The possibility of an alternate life in California, it was a question I had for myself, because I had friends who went to California after college, and I went to New York. It's like you either went to one or the other. So I thought I would write a novel about a young woman who actually did go to Stanford. And so I'd never seen the campus, and I was dying to go out there and get the feel of it so I could write a novel about a young woman going to Stanford. And various circumstances prevented me from going there. I had a lot of other things, responsibilities. And so I found myself writing about a young woman who imagined that she was going to California. The way I couldn't write about her going to California because I hadn't been there. So I made her imagine she went to California. And then the structure of her looking back, that wasn't an initial notion. I forget how that came up to frame the story, but it wasn't difficult to think of it that way. It gave it context and filled it out. And also you get to come full circle and go with her into the present. And in effect, the whole novel takes place on a cruise ship in 1967, because, I mean, not 1967, 2017, because she's, it's in her head. We're in her head the whole time. And so she is trying to imagine going to California and not bringing along her love of her life, Jimmy. She'd think of a different story. But as it turns out, her imagination wrestles with her memories, and she can't get away from Jimmy. There he was.
Well, you know, this was not a planned question, but I'm going to go ahead and pose it because of something you said, which was that you couldn't remember exactly when you made the decision to use the structure that you used. You and I have a friend named Richard Bausch, who's a very fine novelist, and Dick once wrote me a one-sentence email that I thought was one of the strangest things I'd ever gotten. He said, "Hey, I just wanted to ask, do you remember things about your books of when you made a decision to do a particular thing in the book, or anything that went into, you know, the technical choices you made?" And I thought, my first thought was, well, of course I do. And then my second was, no, actually, I don't. Does this happen to you frequently?
Well, when you ask the question about my decision to do the structure a certain way, you know, that almost doesn't apply, because it's not decisions exactly, it's intuitive developments. Things just happen and you follow them along. And I don't know, it's partly that I don't plan things, I discover things, and then I can work to shape them once I realize what I've got going on. But I would never say I'm going to sit down and write a novel about the effects of the Vietnam War on a family, or I just, that's so abstract and intellectual. I have to go in through the characters and the textures. So what obsessed me in the novel was not those issues, but the notion of California, because I hadn't been to Stanford University. I hadn't lived in California. I wanted to know what it was like. And it frustrated me that I couldn't go to see Stanford University. And so I studied the maps, I studied pictures, I studied the history. I tried to estimate how long it would take Jimmy and Ann to take that walk around the campus. I got this all in my imagination from these various details. And I think, and I didn't ever see Stanford until about a year ago. I went there and I had almost finished this novel. And I'm so glad I went because I was able to fill in a few details, especially about the trees, which surprised me. But I think Anne, and trying to, from the deck of the cruise ship and trying to imagine Stanford, I think she succeeds more in imagining California than she does in imagining Jimmy, because Jimmy was real. And I think the details I used about Stanford are meticulously accurate for the most part.
Right. You know, I grew up in the South as well. And I remember during that era, just feeling literally walking around my backyard in the Mississippi Delta, or looking at the hog pen or looking at the cotton patch and thinking, God, if only I could get to California. California seemed to be where everything was. And I thought you tapped into that mythology so beautifully in this novel.
I think we grew up with that mythology, either New York or California. Those are the images that drew us. It's easy to tap into the California dream. And I make use of the Mamas and the Papas song, California Dreaming.
Yeah.
So I didn't know Stanford University, but I thought I'll just figure it out.
Right. Well, you brought up music, and there's a lot of music in this novel. I mean, it's a major motif. And
well, it was 67.
Of course. Yeah. I had the impression reading the book, sometimes you pick a book up by a writer and you may admire the novel tremendously, but you don't have the feeling that this has been something that's been on the writer's mind for a long, long time. And I don't know a lot of your bio. We haven't been friends that long, but one of the things that I felt reading the book was that this story was one that had been with you for a while, at least in your imagination. Is that true?
I think the fact that I was a graduate student in the 60s and all those features of the California scene that occur in Dear Anne, those were happening on the East Coast too. Maybe not in quite the same textures and images, but so much that was going on campus. I knew that. And so I didn't have to do research to concoct the story or to fill in the historical details. One thing I wanted to do was not to to avoid the cliches of the summer of '67 and thereabouts. We see these certain images: the flower children, Woodstock, mud, the protest marches, beads, just various things. And I wanted to write about what I remember experiencing as a student. And one thing, I'm not aware of any fiction about the '60s like this that's about students. And students were so much in the center of what was going on. And I wanted to try to get across what it was like to be a student. And I also thought that it was much more about innocence and desire and the search for identity and wanting a love relationship. And the students then were very, very confused. Everybody I knew was mixed up in some way or another, and everybody was seeing a shrink. And I just wanted to explore that innocence. So I wanted a real story that wasn't all about that didn't center completely on all those conflicts of that era. And so I wanted this love story, and I think that innocence is what I experienced and what I remember. And it's why I wanted to get that music in there, because it dominated. I wanted to get across what it was like to be in the first group to hear Sergeant Pepper. And it just doesn't leave you. It's there.
You know, something you said to me once, that you're so good with a single line. And I think, you know, I can quote individual lines from stories that you wrote 35 years ago. Something you once said to me when the subject of the Beatles came up, I said something, I guess, that didn't make a whole lot of sense to you. And you said, "Oh, Steve, they were about so much more than just the guitar." And to me, that's a great Bobbie Ann Mason line. You know, something that also figures as a motif in this book is that, you know, literature itself, it really matters in this novel. And I wondered if you could say a little bit about that.
Well, Anne and Jimmy are English majors, and I wanted to write about their interest in literature without doing it in a way that would distract or bog down the general reader who has no idea who some of these literary figures might be. So I wanted it, when they talk about Keats and Shelley, I wanted you to get the feeling that they were onto something that really mattered to them. And that's the way I remember reading in graduate school, and the enthusiasm that students had for a writer they've discovered. And, you know, maybe next semester it'll be somebody else, but it's all fresh and new, and they can share it. And there's so much in here that they share, and that becomes memorable for Anne.
Right. So this novel has just been published now, and I remember reading your previous novel. I think that was, what, 2012 or
2011.
2011, which I like very much, by the way, but I like this one more. So were you working on it this whole time?
No, I had many distractions, and I was writing it without any encouragement much, and no feedback, and just kind of on my own. and I didn't have a book contract to spur me on. And I was just, I really didn't have a lot of confidence in it as I was writing it. And I didn't really write and rewrite and rewrite. And it was the same story, but it was like I was polishing it for 3 years.
Okay. I remember that in one of the classes, one of the workshops that you and I did together at the Sewanee Writers Conference a few years ago, you said something along the lines of, well, what you just said, you said, I don't know if I'll ever have another book contract.
Mm.
And I don't know if you saw the look going around with the workshop participants, but they were astounded. And
Probably scared them. Oh, I'm sorry.
and in some sense, so was I. I've been rereading a lot of Faulkner lately, and apparently a pivotal moment in Faulkner's life was when he got Flags in the Dust rejected by his publisher, along with a note saying, and we hope you won't publish this anywhere else either because we think it will damage your career. And Faulkner is supposed to have said, you know what, from now on, I'll just write. I'm just going to write. I'm not going to worry about any of that. I assume there's no audience for what I'm doing. Was that your mindset as you wrote this novel?
No, not at all. I wasn't thinking much about writing. The way this novel came about is that I had written a bunch of stories. All of them in some tangential way had to do with California. And I was going to call this book of stories California Stories. And I thought I would try something like Hemingway's In Our Time and intersperse the stories with little flash fictions.
Yeah.
And that I would make the flash fictions interconnected, so there would be this little story going on amongst these regular short stories. And that lasted about 5 minutes because the little flash fictions turned into Jimmy and Anne.
Ah, okay.
And I don't remember that happening, really, how it happened or what I said about them. But I think I remember that that's where they came from. But the initial inspiration, this had a long, winding road. The initial inspiration was my mother's letters to me when I was away. After I finished The Girl in the Blue Beret, I thought I would read my mother's letters. And I read a few and I thought, oh, these are so great. I'm just going to choose some and make a little book, Mama's Letters. And I read a few and then I started wondering, well, who's she writing to? She sounds like a great character. And so then I think Anne came as a response to Mama's letters and Mama as a character. So Mama's letters, Anne's Mama's letters are interspersed along with other people's letters as documents that are kind of pop up as artifacts from her life. So that was the initial inspiration for this novel.
Something that I frequently tell students is that the way I think of what writers do is that we get up in the morning and on any given day, if you're in the right mind frame, you have to be thinking of the day as one in which something might just fall into your lap that ends up feeding your fiction. Has something like this happened to you before, where you come across something?
Oh yeah, all the time. And I don't go looking for it because it can mess up your life or demand your life for the next 5 years. In about 1989 or 88, I was on a visit home in Western Kentucky. And just by chance, I learned about a story that had been written in the Courier Journal in about 1900. Earlier than that, about a group of a set of quintuplets that had been born in Western Kentucky. And they were locally famous, but I'd never heard the story. And it turned out that these quintuplets were born across the field from my house where I grew up. And they were born up near the railroad track. And it was quite a story. And the train stopped, and people on the train rushed out to go see this a strange event and miraculous event. And of course, the quintuplets didn't survive. But I thought that the afternoon I heard this story, within an hour, I knew that was a novel and it belonged to me. It was my story to write because it happened right there. And of course, there wasn't a whole lot more to be known about the real story, so I made it up, and it was. I knew it would be a long novel. That was one thing I knew that afternoon.
When you make a decision that something is, I probably have used a word you won't like there with decision. Is it always like this for you, that you feel an incredible connection to something and that becomes the thing you write about because it feels like you have to?
Yeah, it's like it's like something like a seed that has a lot of potential in it. You can see, you can relate to it. It has there's a story in there if you can find it. Well, like I understood that it would be a long novel because it was a big drama, and the parents, a big family, a journey on a train to Washington, and a journey through the South to show these babies at these carnival shows. Just lots of stuff in there to explore.
Where do you think the ability to see that something can be a story or a novel comes from in your case? Is it something you were born with? Does it come from hearing people tell stories as a child? Does it come from your reading? Where does it come from?
It certainly didn't come from hearing stories as a child because that wasn't our style. There weren't enough stories. It's probably something I was born with. Just a way of, I guess, an overwhelming curiosity. I think I had a very lively mind, and so I didn't speak out loud much at all, but I had a lively interior.
Yeah, if someone asks you whether or not, let me preface this with an anecdote. You and I both knew a writer named Larry Brown from Mississippi.
Mm-hmm.
And Larry and I used to have an argument that raged for years. It was about the question of talent. What is talent? And Larry said there's no such thing as talent. If there was such a thing as talent, he said he would not have become a writer. And I would argue, yeah, there is something as there is such a thing as talent. Where would you come down on that side of the question?
Somewhere in the middle, probably. I think for example, there are plenty of people who are brilliant singers and do right well in the church choir, but they don't have the need to get a guitar and try to become a pop idol. Mm-hmm. Or they're quite satisfied using their talent in that way. So I think the talent, the ability, has to have a strong motivation. And so I guess I'm saying that any almost anybody can have talent, but what do you do with it, and why do you need to prove yourself, to prove to others that you have this talent?
Right.
Or if you don't have enough talent, you may be motivated to show others that you do have it.
Something I told a group of graduate students last night, right here, because this is my classroom now, was that I've always felt that there were probably 10 people walking the earth with the talent to be writers, whatever that means. And to me, it just means that they look at the world in such a way that they can make stories out of it if they chose. But there are probably 10 people out there with the talent for everyone who has the need to make those stories.
Yeah.
So in your case, where do you think the need to make the stories comes from?
I think it's the isolation of my background, and maybe the lack of stories.
Were there, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I don't know.
Were there a lot of books in your house? Were you a reader as a child?
I was a big reader, but there were not that many books. So I read Nancy Drew and the Bobbsey Twins and the Hardy Boys when I think Richard Bausch's grandchildren are at present reading Wuthering Heights and James Joyce. So I graduated to Little Women, and then in high school I didn't read.
And you wrote a dissertation, I believe, on the work of Vladimir Nabokov.
I did indeed.
Has that fed your own work in any way?
Yes, I think that Nabokov and Joyce were my favorite writers in graduate school, and discovering them was like discovering wonderful, huge jigsaw puzzles, and that's really behind whatever it is that I do, jigsaw puzzles and puzzles of all kinds. So they, the way they used language, it just thrilled me to see what they could do with words. And I'm more interested in words and phrases than I am in a complete story.
Okay.
So basically, I fiddle around. Just rearranging words and finding words and phrases and seeing if it adds up to anything.
And so when you were working on this book, what was a typical day like for you? Was this something you were doing every day, or did you take big breaks from it?
I was working on it for 2 weeks on Cape Cod at Pam Painter's Cape Cod house. I called it a writer's retreat, and I started the basic book there. I think I had the various notions together, and I was going to write about Anne and Jimmy when I was there. And then I got delayed on that for a year, and put it aside, and tried to come back to it a year later. And then I just fiddled around with it. As I said, I didn't have a lot of confidence in it. So a typical day is reading what I've written already and seeing if I can improve it, and I might change a few words.
Okay. So in other words, that suggests to me that maybe like me, you tend to revise as you go rather than writing all the way to the end of a whole book and then going back and looking and trying to figure out what's wrong.
No, I've heard you described how you write a page and then you go on to the next page and you're revising. I tend to try to shoot out the whole thing as fast as I can, and then go back and try to polish it and revise it and see what it needs. It's no, I don't. I just leave it rough and then keep going back to it. And it varies, but
Well, I'm going to ask you one last thing, and then I think we're going to need to go ahead and let the people in the audience pose some questions. I just got to know what you're working on next. What do I have to look forward to?
oh gosh, I don't know. I was thinking maybe I should look at those California stories again.
Oh, that's music to my ears.
Okay.
I think I need to turn it over to either Rachel or David now.
Well, thank you all both so much. This has been such a fascinating conversation. Yeah, so if anyone has a question for the authors, please type it in the question in the chat box. To start with, though, I've got a question for both of you. Steve, you mentioned Faulkner, and Bobbie, you mentioned both Nabokov and Joyce. What other authors have been really influential for you both?
Louisa May Alcott. Let's see. J.D. Salinger, Hemingway, Fitzgerald, with Nabokov and Joyce. All the writers that were formative in my schooling, that I kind of hang on to those as ideals.
Ones that really had a huge influence on me, one would be William Trevor, the Irish short story writer and novelist. Another would be Alice Munro, who I felt like just basically with a book like Open Secrets just kind of exploded the short stories, so that, you know, you could see she was doing something with form that I had never seen before. And then another one who was really important to me, especially when I was a young writer, was Graham Greene. But truly, the formative moment for me was the first time I read Bobbie Ann Mason. And I mean it from the bottom of my heart, because I felt like my life probably was not terribly different from hers. I grew up on a farm in the Mississippi Delta. Nobody looking at me would have figured out that I'd become a writer. But what I saw in her work was a writer from the South who was writing with a voice that I hadn't heard before, who was not so much obviously influenced by people like Robert Penn Warren or the big names in Southern fiction, but who clearly had a different set of reference points.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would add Donald Barthelme.
Oh, yeah.
Another Southerner. There's a question in the chat from Pamela Painter for Bobbie. Would you say a few words about the other letters in the novel, those from Albert?
There are letters at the beginning of Dear Anne from Anne's mentor and professor from as an undergrad, and he had encouraged her to go to California and to go to Stanford, where he had been. And so she, at the very beginning of the novel, is remembering his letters, and that's what provokes her to imagine what if she'd gone to California. So I think I needed that impetus to give strength to that sense of direction.
I'd love to ask Bobbie, about how you experience writing short fiction and memoir differently, because all of those are part of your writing world. And I wonder if that process is very similar for you for each genre, or if you approach your writing in a different way.
I think all of it, novels and stories and memoir and even nonfiction, which I find very hard to do because it isn't fiction. There's more similarity than not. The memoir, for example, I wrote it much as if it were fiction, although I was writing about real people and my real past. But I wanted it to come to life, so I used setting and description, and I did a few innovative things, like developing scenes in the present, conversations with my mother, and a little quest I went on into genealogy. And so I tried to make it dramatic with scenes and dialogue and commentary as if I were writing something that develops like fiction. And the nonfiction, it's always difficult for me having to stick to facts, not just facts, but a way of telling. So I've tried to be innovative with some of that.
Thank you. We've hosted a number of authors during this pandemic virtually, and we've kind of heard all over the place how some people it's no effect on their writing, and some people they just can't write. Bobbie, how has it affected your writing life?
I haven't done any writing in a long time, all year. And I think being at home all the time, I think you can develop more to do than maybe you did before. I'm not out in the world very much anyway, so life isn't much different, maybe psychologically. And the hair, pandemic hair.
I don't have that problem. Steve, how about you? How's your writing been during this time?
Well, I was nearing the end of a novel when the pandemic struck, and it got hard to write, especially in April, because we were having a lot of infections here right around where I live. It was one of the hardest hit places in the country for a while. It was painful to see it, you know. But I got to the end of the book, and then I wrote an essay about how musicians were coping with the pandemic, because if you want to look at a class of people who lost everything all at once, they certainly would fit the bill. Everybody's performance is canceled. You know, people who are used to being before an audience, if not every night, you know, 3 or 4 nights a week. And so talking to them kind of helped me through it. I thought, yeah, I mean, I'm having some different circumstances to deal with, but I can still do what I do right here in this room. I don't need anybody else around. It made me a little more appreciative of the ability to just keep doing it, you know.
Mm.
Well, thank you. I think we're just about out of time. If there's any other questions, please type them in the chat. But unless we have any others, maybe you could both recommend some things that you've been reading recently.
I've read Jill McCorkle's wonderful Hieroglyphics, and I've read, let's see, I thought it was here, a wonderful book by Margaret Verble, Verble, called Cherokee America, about Cherokee community in Oklahoma in the 19th century, and it's Just fantastic writing, wonderful characters. And I read, just after that, I read My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante, my introduction to those fabulous novels.
Well, I'm glad I have it here. I read this.
Oh,
This is Pamela
yes,
Snyder's New and
I-
Selected Stories, Fabrications, and it is spectacular. It is just a magnificent book. And I second Bobbie Ann's comments about Joe McCorkle's hieroglyphics. Margot Livesey's new novel is just magnificent.
yes, I read that too. Great.
Yeah, one of the best books to come along in a long, long time. But I'm rereading Faulkner. I was so scared of Faulkner that I basically have not read him since I was young. And I told my friend Ron Rash the other day, Faulkner saved me once when I was young, and now he's saving me again when I'm old. But just the extraordinary nature of that vision.
Well, Steve, Bobbie, thank you both so much. The new book is Dear Anne, and this has been a terrific event. Thank you guys so much and have a great evening.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for having us. This has been a real pleasure, very relaxed and lovely, and I wish your store well during the season.
Thank y'all both so much, and y'all take care and have a good evening, guys.
Good night, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.
Thanks for coming.
Bye.
Bye.